Hello, beautiful community. Elon Musk has said that he denied Starlink satellite internet service access to Ukraine months ago to prevent a Ukrainian attack on the Russian fleet. And his motivation was nuclear escalation, worries, reduction of nuclear risk. If there is going to be one takeaway in our chat, and I've made a couple of notes, and I'm sorry we're speaking so late. I was trying to work up my health to join you today, and it took a while. But if there is one takeaway from today, it's that we spent too much time talking about the way power is exercised, the extent, the shape of its exercise, but not enough about the source of power. And very often the problem is that the source of power is in the wrong hands in a certain situation, such that the problem isn't what specific thing they do or don't do, but that they have a certain power that it is not ideal for them to have. We'll come back to that. Now, the effects of Elon's actions in practice we won't dwell on. They certainly plausibly include extra possibility for Russian ships to fire rockets at Ukraine's civilian infrastructure. And they probably don't include any meaningful reduction of nuclear risk, contrary to what Elon Musk thinks. We'll say more about that. The number of bad arguments being peddled by people who are attacking Musk here is absolutely extraordinary. So let's just pick one of them that unfortunately I've seen repeated by academics and experts on social media today. And it's, can't you see how much worse Elon Musk is at this than the US government? So therefore, this is obviously the sort of decision we should want the US government to make. Now, there are two answers to this very silly line of argument. And the first is that that is true in this case, but even here it's not obviously true, it's just true. But it could easily be untrue in another case, right? An alternate administration, a Trump administration with some unlovely characters around Trump may, at a certain time, be in a worse position to make a decision like this than some kind of Elon Musk II or some kind of other giant entrepreneur who is not Musk himself. So this is just contingent. I could easily imagine the US government being worse at making various kinds of decisions about security than Bill Gates, for example, would be, right? Doesn't matter what we think of him. This is just purely contingency. So that's not the argument you make. You don't say that this is something that the United States government and the US president should do instead of Musk because they're going to be better at it. You say this is the sort of thing they should do because they can do it legitimately and more democratically. Joe Biden's decision on an issue like this isn't better than Musk's because it's better than Musk's. It's better than Musk's because it's democratic, whether it's better or not, and it happens to be better in this case. So that's a fundamental point, right, with which we need to start, rather than having contingent debates, right, about whether Musk is 2 times worse or 7 times worse than the US government at making a decision like this. The point is, even if he were better, there'd be a problem with him making a decision like that, even if he made it well. Obviously, because of course there is another part of East London here in this direction called Dalston, and it probably has the best kebab places in the UK, and the kebab places are fantastic, but their owners wouldn't be good at making decisions about European and North American and Ukrainian national security, as good as they are at kebabs. And Elon Musk does not have more legitimacy or more democratic adequacy vis-a-vis a decision like this than these guys do, right? And that would not stop being a problem, even if you prove to me that guy number 3 with the kebab shop actually would be better than Biden at this. Musk came out with a pro-peace position. And we don't mind a pro-peace position. I mean, a good pro-peace position is, let's say that this war can be settled under condition whereby both parties, right, make sure that they do not occupy any of the other party's land. And then they permanently stay within that commitment, right? But that's not the Elon proposal. Elon says both sides should agree to a truce. Every day that passes, more Ukrainian and Russian youth die to gain and lose small pieces of land, with borders barely changing. This is not worth their lives. Now, that actually stands against the analysis I recommend, which you're very familiar with, so I won't reheat old cabbage here. We'll just simply say that cessation of fire now helps Putin start a more effective war a couple of years from now. And that's not just a kind of preference that Putin has, it's a fundamental escalation approach that is now tied up with the Putin regime's conception of its own regime security. So that will be a way to exchange violence today for worse violence tomorrow. And Ukrainians get that miraculously. But there's a kind of usefulness in this remark from Musk, because it represents the drift of Western citizens over the next few months, right? That palpable image of fighting sponsored by a lot of money from the United States in particular, that doesn't generate more than an exchange of 20 kilometers here, 4 kilometers there, that I think will dissuade a lot of people from enthusiasm for sustained support for Ukraine. I'm just reporting that as an interpretation of where the weather is at, if you like, in relation to this. But there is one kind of specific form of escalation that's worth mentioning here, where Ukraine's interests don't quite align with those of the United States, and that's nuclear escalation. Quite obviously, because it's Ukraine's survival that's at stake, Ukraine is going to be open to taking a high nuclear risk to get a good outcome than the United States would. Indeed, the number one priority of the Biden administration is to avoid escalation, and particularly nuclear escalation. That's not a priority that Ukraine lacks, as it were, but it's a priority far lower down Ukraine's list. And that is not entirely reconcilable, right? In other words, a healthy and proportionate level of nuclear escalation management that the United States must engage in is a contradiction of Ukraine's key national interests. Let me say something about this business of the source of power. And here we could briefly shift from Musk, if you like, the interferer in global matters of security, to Musk as the facilitator of one of the public squares in Western democracies, and that's Twitter. So much of the debate has proceeded around what Musk should do in managing this public square, and that has shaped itself up to be a conversation about extent and nature of the interference, right? but we are forgetting that the problem is the source here. And this business of endlessly debating how somebody who has no legitimate power should exercise that power without having a discussion of why they have that illegitimate power and whether there could be solutions to it. And often there are no obvious solutions, right? The solutions to the ownership of our public squares by essentially kebab shops, or owners that have no more democratic legitimacy to run our public squares than the owners of kebab shops do. That's a problem that does not have obvious solutions. I believe there are some solutions, but they're not obvious and it requires a complex conversation. So this isn't a matter of pointing out a problem that you can fix with the flick of a finger, but nevertheless, it is absolutely incredible, right, how little of the conversation about, let us say, Twitter is about the arbitrary whims, right, of an individual who has a certain degree of power without any legitimacy, rather than particular policies around how the algorithm works and what kind of speech is bumped and what kind of speech is deprioritized. In the history of the Western world, there is a tradition of Roman and Neo-Roman thought that rather sharply, at least at a level of concern, contradicts some of the liberal tradition of thought over the past few centuries, from which I myself, in a certain sense, derive. And it's very important to be very grateful for other traditions as potentially complementary, right? And one of the things we can learn from this neo-Roman or republicanist tradition is to understand that when we talk about being free, we worry about the extent of others getting in our way, or the extent of the threats of others getting in our way, and we don't worry enough about dependence, right? Because we could be, as it were, free to act in the way we want. We may enjoy an absence of impediments to our basic projects that is indeed very welcome, but that absence may be a product of the whims of a certain body or a certain individual who nevertheless has power over us, even though as things stand we can do what we want, right? And indeed we're not even threatened that a scenario may come about in which we might not be able to do what we want. But the very fact that that scenario could come about, right, is a freedom deficit in terms of the situation we find ourselves in. Now, I myself actually tend to not share that argument, but not because I deny the concern. It's because I often would prefer that concern to be expressed in terms of other values, not freedom. But nevertheless, that tradition can teach us something very important. So we've got a situation where, we are not paying enough attention to the sources of power in our society when we have conversations about how things should proceed. And that's really, really tremendously important. Now, do I want to say anything more about this? No, because that would turn into a political philosophy video. So I'm not going to say anymore. But it's of enormous importance that so often when we squabble with each other about extent and shape of facilitation, management of a certain space, for example, we don't spend that time talking about the source of power. And I think that's tremendously important. I think that's, in a certain sense, the lesson that we can draw from this Elon story. because this would not be a pretty story if Elon decided to do the right thing, quote unquote, whatever you think that is. Let's assume to not obstruct the facilitation of Ukraine carrying out their drone attack, right? If Elon had done that, that'd be still something really wrong, and be issues of legitimacy, right, around how come it is that he's making decisions like that. And that remains true, right? That crisis of legitimacy remains there, even if there isn't an immediate solution for how to fix the problem. Lots of left talk very soon.